Some decisions cost you everything you own, others cost you everything you are. Kalen Ford stood in the clearing with his rifle raised, finger resting on the trigger, staring at the creature that could save his life or end it. The white buffalo didn't run. It didn't charge. It simply watched him with eyes that seemed to know something he didn't behind it. The entire herd stood motionless, waiting. The wind carried dust across the ground between them. In that moment, Kalen understood that pulling the trigger would be the easiest thing he'd ever do. Not pulling it would haunt him forever. 3 weeks earlier, Marlo Kane had arrived at his cabin with an offer that made his hands shake. The pelt of a white buffalo could buy land, cattle, a future that didn't involve sleeping on a thin bedroll with his rifle across his chest. Kalen had spent 15 years tracking game across these territories, and he'd never missed a shot that mattered. His reputation was built on cold precision, on understanding that sentiment didn't fill an empty stomach. But standing here now, watching the white buffalo's massive frame block the morning light, something felt wrong. The animal's coat gleamed like fresh snow, unmarked except for a single scar across its right shoulder. Old injury healed clean. The herd behind it numbered maybe 40, all watching with the same unnatural stillness. Callan had hunted buffalo for half his life. He knew their patterns, their panic, the way they scattered when danger came close. This was different. This was deliberate. His arms ached from holding the rifle steady. The buffalo's breath came out in slow clouds. 20 feet separated them. An easy shot, a fortune waiting. All he had to do was squeeze. Instead, he found himself lowering the barrel an inch. Then another. The buffalo's dark eyes never blinked, never wavered. Kalen thought about the $300 Marlo had promised. He thought about the winter coming, about the empty shelves in his cabin, about the way his father had died broken, bitter in a boarding house that smelled like kerosene and defeat. Then he thought about something else, something he couldn't name, a feeling that rose up from somewhere deeper than hunger or fear. He'd killed hundreds of buffalo, thousands maybe, but he'd never looked one in the eye like this. Never felt like the animal was asking him a question he didn't know how to answer. The rifle dropped another inch. His fingers slipped off the trigger. The white buffalo took one step forward, not aggressive, almost curious. The morning sun caught the edges of its horns, and for a moment, Kalen saw his own reflection in those dark, knowing eyes. He couldn't do it. The realization hit him like a gut punch. After everything he'd done, every animal he'd tracked and taken down without a second thought, he couldn't pull the trigger on this one. It made no sense. It went against every practical bone in his body. But his arms were already lowering the rifle completely, and his hands were already shaking, and his mind was already screaming at him that he was throwing away his last chance at something better. The white buffalo huffed once. Steam rose from its nostrils. Then slowly, almost deliberately, it turned and began walking back toward the herd. The other buffalo parted to let it through, and within moments, the entire group was moving away across the grassland, their hooves creating a rhythm like distant thunder. Ken stood alone in the clearing, rifle hanging useless at his side, watching $300 disappear over the ridge. He felt hollow, lighter somehow, but completely empty. He had no idea what he'd just done or why. All he knew was that something in that animal's eyes had reached inside him and stopped his hand, and now it was gone, and he was standing in the dust with nothing to show for 3 weeks of tracking except the sick feeling that he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. What he didn't know was that the white buffalo would remember, in years from now, when Ken needed mercy more than he'd ever needed anything. That memory would be the only thing standing between him and the end. Marlo Kane didn't take the news well. He stood in the doorway of Ken's cabin 3 days later, face red, hands clenched into fists at his sides. The morning light cut sharp angles across his features, making him look older than his years. You had the shot. Kalen sat at his table, cleaning his rifle with methodical strokes. He didn't look up. I did. And you just let it walk away. Marlo's voice climbed higher. $300 gone. Because of what exactly? A feeling? The rag moved across the barrel in slow circles. Kalen had asked himself the same question for 3 days straight. He still didn't have an answer that made. Since something like that, you're finished, Marlowe stepped inside without invitation, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. You know that, right? Word gets around. A hunter who can't pull the trigger is no hunter at all. Nobody's going to hire you after this. Kalen set down the rifle and finally met his eyes. Then I guess I'll find something else to do. With what money? You're 3 months behind on supplies. Winter's coming. Where are you going to eat when the snow gets deep? Marlowe leaned against the door frame, arms crossed. I could have gotten you set up, real future, but you threw it away for some animal that doesn't even know you exist. That part stuck in Kalen's chest like a splinter. The white buffalo didn't know him, didn't care about him. It was just an animal following instinct, and he projected some kind of meaning onto a moment that probably meant nothing. He'd made a choice based on a feeling he couldn't explain, and now he was going to pay for it. Marlowe pushed off from the doorframe. I'll give you one more chance. Track it again. Bring me that pelt, and we'll forget this happened. No, the word came out flat. Final. Marlowe stared at him for a long moment, then shook his head. Slowly. You're a fool, Forge, a broke, stupid fool. He turned toward the door, then paused. When you're starving this winter, remember this conversation. Remember that you chose an animal over your own survival. The door slammed behind him. Ken listened to the horses. Hooves fade into the distance, then picked up his rifle again. His hands weren't steady. Marlowe was right about everything. The practical part of his brain knew it. He'd made an irrational choice that would cost him dearly. Other hunters would hear about this. His reputation would suffer. Work would dry up. The winter would be harsh. But when he closed his eyes, he saw those dark, intelligent eyes staring back at him. Saw the way the white buffalo had stepped forward without fear, as if testing something in him. And deep down, in a place he didn't have words for, Kalen knew he'd made the only choice he could live with, even if it destroyed him. Even if Marlowe's prediction came true and he ended up like his father, broke and bitter and alone, at least he'd be able to look at himself in the mirror. At least he'd know that when it mattered, when everything was on the line, he'd chosen something other than money. The question now was whether that choice would be enough to keep him alive through what came next, because winter was coming and mercy didn't fill an empty stomach, and somewhere out there, the white buffalo was running free while Ken sat in his cabin wondering if he'd just signed his own ending. For years, changed a man in ways he didn't always recognize. Kalen guided his horse through the narrow canyon pass, eyes scanning the ridge line out of habit. He wasn't a hunter anymore, hadn't been for a long time. These days he worked as a scout and guide, leading merchant wagons through the territories, reading the land for danger, making sure people got where they needed to go. The pay was steady, not great, but steady. The merchant train behind him consisted of 3 wagons carrying grain and tools to the settlement at Broken Creek. Simple job, 2 days' ride through familiar country. Nothing about it suggested trouble, but Kalen's instincts, honed by 15 years of tracking, told him something felt wrong. The birds had gone quiet an hour ago. The air carried a tension he couldn't name. He raised his hand, signaling the wagons to stop. The lead merchant, a heavy man named Porter, rode up beside him. Problem? Maybe. Stay here. Kalen dismounted and moved forward. On foot, rifle ready. The canyon walls rose steep on both sides, creating natural choke points. Good place for an ambush. He'd led wagons through here a dozen times without incident, but that didn't mean the first shot cracked from the ridge. Porter's horse screamed and went down. Kalen dove behind a boulder as 3 more shots followed, kicking up dirt where he'd been standing. He pressed his back against the stone, breathing hard, mind racing through options for shooters, maybe 5 high. Ground advantage. The merchants were exposed on the trail. Get the wagons back, he shouted. Move. But Porter was on the ground, pinned under his fallen horse, yelling in pain. The other merchants hesitated, torn between running and helping. Another volley of shots decided for them. They whipped their horses around and retreated, leaving Porter behind. leaving Kalen behind. Smart choice, staying would get them all taken. Kalen understood the logic, didn't make it easier to accept. He checked his ammunition. 10 rounds. Not enough for a sustained fight. The shooters on the ridge were taking their time now, knowing they had him trapped. One of them called down, voice rough with amusement, drop the rifle and walk away. We just want the wagons, Kalen. Didn't answer. His eyes tracked the canyon walls, looking for any path up, any angle that might give him chance. Nothing. The rock face was too steep, too exposed, Porter grown somewhere. Behind him, still pinned, the man would need help getting free, which meant Ken couldn't run, even if he wanted to. He leaned around the boulder and fired twice at the ridge. Return fire came immediately, forcing him back. They had patience, they had position, they had him pinned like an animal in a trap. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Kalen thought about Marlowe's words from 4 years ago, about choices and consequences, about how mercy didn't fill an empty stomach or save your life. When it mattered, the irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spared the white buffalo and lost his career. Now he was about to lose everything else. The shooters were moving, spreading out along the ridge. Soon they'd have angles on his position from multiple sides. When that happened, the boulder wouldn't protect him anymore. Callan ejected the spent shells and reloaded with hands that didn't shake whatever came next. He'd face it the same way he'd faced that white buffalo 4 years ago, on his feet, looking it in the eye. Even if this time, mercy wasn't coming to save him, the bullet caught him in the side as he made his run. Not deep, but deep enough. Callan felt the impact like a hammer. Blow, stumbled, kept moving. He'd gotten Porter free and onto one of the remaining horses, sent him riding hard toward the merchant wagons. That was all he could do. Now, it was about survival. His own horse had taken a bullet to the neck early in the fight. The animal had dropped fast, leaving Kalen on foot with 4 armed men coming down from the ridge. He'd fired back, bought himself time, then run not west toward the settlements. They'd expect that. He went north into the open grassland where the terrain offered no cover but stretched for miles in every direction. Bad choice maybe, but the only choice he had. The wound in his side burned with each step. He pressed his hand against it, felt warm blood soaking through his shirt. Not fatal, not yet, but blood loss would slow him down, make him weak, and the men behind him were mounted. They'd catch up eventually. The sun climbed higher. Kalen's throat turned to sand. He'd lost his canteen somewhere in the canyon along with most of his supplies. His rifle was still strapped across his back, but ammunition was down to 3 rounds, 3 bullets against 4 men. Poor odds, the kind of odds that usually ended one way. He risked a glance behind him. 3 riders visible on the horizon, maybe half a mile back. They weren't rushing. They knew he was wounded, knew he couldn't maintain this pace. They were letting him exhaust himself, waiting for him to collapse so they could finish the job without risk. Smart strategy. Kalen would have done the same thing. He forced his legs to keep moving. Even as his vision started to blur at the edges, the grassland seemed endless. No trees, no rocks, no shelter, just open country under a merciless sky. His father used to say the frontier had no mercy for the weak. Kalen understood that now more than ever. The wound pulled with each breath. He could feel himself slowing down, his body betraying him step by step. The riders behind him were getting closer. He could hear their horses now, a steady rhythm that matched his failing heartbeat. They were talking to each other, voices carrying across the flat land, laughing about something. Kalen's boot caught on nothing, and he went down hard, face first into the dirt. For a moment, he just lay there tasting blood and dust, lungs screaming for air. Get up. He had to get up, but his body didn't want to listen anymore. The blood loss was catching up to him faster than he'd expected. He rolled on his back, staring up at the cloudless sky. The riders were close now, maybe 200 yards. He could see their faces, see the rifles resting easy across their saddles. They'd stopped their horses, sitting there watching him struggle. One of them said something, and the others laughed again. Kalen forced himself to sit up. His hand found the rifle, pulled it around, 3 bullets, he'd make them count. At least he'd die facing them. At least he'd go down fighting. His finger found the trigger, and he raised the barrel toward the approaching riders. The movement sent fresh pain through his side, but he held steady, waited for them to come into range. Then something changed. One of the riders pulled up short, pointing at something beyond Callan, the others. Stopped too, confusion on their faces. Callan didn't understand what they were seeing until he heard it. A sound like distant thunder, growing louder, coming from behind him. Callan twisted around, every movement sending fresh agony through his wounded side. The grassland behind him seemed to ripple and shift. And for a moment, his blood-starved brain couldn't process what he was seeing. Then the shapes resolved into focus, and his breath caught in his throat. Buffalo, dozens of them, maybe more, moving across the plain in a steady, deliberate march, not running, not stampeding, just walking with clear purpose, headed directly toward him. And at the front of the herd, massive and unmistakable even at a distance, was the white buffalo he'd spared for years ago. The scar on its right shoulder caught the sunlight. They avoided humans, scattered at the first sign of danger. They didn't march in formation toward armed men like soldiers on a battlefield, but Callan's eyes weren't lying to him. The herd was coming, and they showed no sign of stopping. The riders behind him had gone completely still. Their horses shifted nervously, picking up on something their masters couldn't see. One of the men raised his rifle, then lowered it again, uncertain. The lead rider, the one who'd been laughing minutes ago, turned his horse sideways, watching the approaching herd. With visible confusion, Callan's rifle slipped from his grip. He didn't have the strength to hold it anymore. His vision was tunneling, dark spots dancing at the edges. He could feel consciousness slipping away, his body shutting down from blood loss and exhaustion. The last thing he saw before his eyes closed was the white buffalo, still walking toward him with that same steady, purposeful gait. When he woke, he didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes, maybe. The sun hadn't moved far, but everything else had changed. He was lying on his back in the grass, staring up at the sky, and surrounding him on all sides was a wall of living flesh. The buffalo had formed a circle, perfect, deliberate, with him at the center. He could see their massive bodies blocking out the horizon, could hear their breathing, smell the dust, and musk of their hides. They stood shoulder to shoulder, facing outward, creating a barrier between him and the rest of the world. Callan tried to sit up and failed. His body wouldn't cooperate, but he could turn his head enough to see through the gaps between the animals. The riders were still there, maybe 50 yards away, but they dismounted now, standing beside their horses, rifles held loose at their sides. They were arguing. He could see their mouths moving, hands gesturing, but they weren't approaching. The white buffalo stood directly in front of him, its bulk blocking most of his view. It turned its head slightly, and for just a moment, those dark eyes met his, the same eyes that had looked at him 4 years ago when he'd had his finger on the trigger, the same unusual steadiness he'd witnessed in that clearing. Callan's hand moved to his side, pressed against the wound, still bleeding but slower now. He wasn't going to die in the next hour, maybe not even in the next few hours. The herd had bought him time. Against all expectation, they'd bought him time. One of the riders shouted something. The white buffalo huffed once, loud and deliberate. The sound rippled through the herd. Every buffalo in the circle shifted slightly, tightening their formation. The message was clear, even to Callan's fading mind. They weren't moving, and anyone who tried to get through them would regret it. The riders seemed to understand, too. After another minute of heated discussion, they mounted their horses and turned away, not running, just leaving, accepting that whatever was happening here was beyond their willingness to challenge. Callan watched them disappear over the ridge, then let his head fall back against the ground. The buffalo remained unmoving, protecting him just like the title had promised. Time moved strangely when you were bleeding out under an open sky. Callan drifted in and out of consciousness, each time waking to find the circle of buffalo still surrounding him. They didn't move, didn't graze. Just stood there like sentinels, blocking the wind and the sun, and anything else that might threaten the man at their center. He managed to tear a strip from his shirt and pack it against the wound. The bleeding had slowed to a seep, which meant he might actually survive this might. His canteen was gone, and thirst was becoming a more immediate problem than blood loss. His tongue felt thick and useless in his mouth. The afternoon sun beat down. Without mercy, the white buffalo shifted its weight, and Ken heard something he hadn't noticed before: water running. Water, somewhere close, a stream maybe or a spring. The sound was faint but unmistakable. He tried to push himself up and failed. His arms wouldn't hold his weight. The effort left him gasping. Fresh blood seeping through the makeshift bandage. One of the buffalo near him, a younger female, moved aside. Slightly, through the gap she created, Callan could see what he'd missed before. 20 yards away, partially hidden by the tall grass, was a shallow creek cutting through the grassland. Clear water running over smooth stones. He stared at it for a long moment, then looked back at the young buffalo. She was watching him with the same calm intelligence he'd seen in the white buffalo's eyes, almost like she knew, like she understood what he needed and was showing him where to find it. Ken started crawling. Every movement was agony, but he forced himself forward. Inch by painful inch, the buffalo didn't stop him. They adjusted their position. Slightly, maintaining the protective circle, but allowing him space to move. It took him 10 minutes to cover 20 yards. By the time he reached the creek, his vision was swimming and his hand was shaking so badly he could barely cup the water, but the water was cold and clean and tasted like salvation. He drank until his stomach cramped, then splashed it over his face and neck. The shock of cold helped clear his head. He lay there, at the creek's edge, feeling strength slowly seep back into his limbs. Not much, but enough. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The buffalo remained, dark shapes against the fading light. Callan watched the white buffalo's silhouette, trying to understand what was happening. Animals didn't typically do this. They didn't protect humans. They didn't show behavior that resembled compassion or memory. Everything he knew about the natural world said this was extraordinarily rare, but it was happening anyway. For years ago, he'd made a choice that went against his nature, his training, his survival instinct. He'd spared a life when every practical consideration said to take it, and now that same animal had returned with its herd, standing guard over him. When he needed it most, not magic, not destiny, just unusual animal behavior. Just the rare, remarkable connection that sometimes formed between two living things when circumstances aligned in unexpected ways. Callan closed his eyes, listening to the buffalo's steady breathing and the quiet rush of the creek. He was alive against all odds. Against every reasonable expectation, he was still alive. The wound would heal. The thirst was manageable now, and somewhere out there, Porter would have reached the settlements by now. Help might be coming. All he had to do was survive the night. And he wasn't alone anymore. Dawn came cold and clear. Ken woke stiff and aching, but alive. The buffalo were still there, though some had moved during the night to graze in small shifts, while others maintained the protective circle. The white buffalo stood in the same position as before, facing east toward the rising sun. Its breath made clouds in the morning air. Callan's wound had stopped bleeding entirely. The makeshift bandage was crusted with dry blood, but when he checked beneath it, the injury looked clean, shallow enough that infection might not set in if he kept it covered. Lucky, incredibly lucky, the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting anything vital. Another inch to the left, and he'd have bled out hours ago. He drank more water from the creek, then used the cold stream to clean the wound as best he could. The shock of it almost made him pass out, but he held steady, pressing the wet cloth against the torn flesh until the pain settled into something manageable. He tore another strip from his shirt and re-wrapped it tight. The sun climbed higher. The buffalo began to show signs of restlessness, shifting their weight, huffing among themselves. they'd been standing guard for almost a full day now. Sooner or later, their own needs would override whatever instinct had brought them here. Kalen understood that he was grateful for every hour they'd given him. Then he heard it. Horses, multiple riders approaching from the south. The buffalo heard it too. The entire herd turned as one. Facing the sound, Cal tensed, hand reaching for the rifle he dropped yesterday. But the white buffalo didn't seem alarmed. It stood calm and watchful, waiting. 3 riders crested the ridge. Kalen recognized Porter in the lead, bandaged and sitting awkwardly in his saddle. But alive, behind him rode 2 men Kalen knew from the settlements. Good men, armed, but not hostile. They pulled up short when they saw the buffalo hands, moving instinctively toward their weapons. "Easy," Porter called out, his voice carrying across the grassland. "Don't spook them. Forge is in there." The men dismounted slowly, eyes wide as they took in the scene, a full herd of buffalo surrounding a wounded man, standing guard like soldiers. It was the kind of thing people would talk about for years, the kind of story that would get bigger with each telling until nobody believed it was true. Porter walked forward on foot, moving carefully. The buffalo watched but didn't react. When he got within 20 feet, the white buffalo turned its massive head toward him. Porter froze for a long moment. Man and animal stared at each other. Then the white buffalo huffed once and stepped aside, creating an opening in the circle. Permission, or at least acceptance. Porter moved through the gap and knelt beside Kalen. "You look terrible. Feel worse." Kalen's voice came out as a croak. "The men who attacked us, gone, probably figured you were done for." Porter glanced around at the buffalo. "How is this happening?" "Long story." Kalen accepted Porter's hand and let himself be pulled to his feet. Every muscle screamed in protest, but he stayed upright. "I'll tell you on the way back." The other 2 men brought up a spare horse. Kalen mounted slowly, gritting his teeth against the pain. The buffalo began to disperse now, breaking their formation and moving away across the grassland, all except the white buffalo. It stood watching as Kalen settled into the saddle, those dark eyes meeting his one last time. Kalen raised his hand, not quite a wave, more like an acknowledgement, a recognition of what had passed between them 4 years ago and again yesterday. The white buffalo dipped its head slightly, then turned and walked away to rejoin its herd. Within minutes, they were gone over the ridge, leaving nothing but hoof prints in the grass, and a story that Ken would carry for the rest of his life. 6 weeks later, Kalen stood outside his cabin, watching the sunset paint the grasslands in shades of copper and gold. The wound in his side had healed to a thick scar, tender when he pressed it, but no longer painful. He'd spent most of the recovery time thinking about what had happened out there, trying to make sense of it in a way that fit the world he understood. He never could. Some things didn't have explanations that made sense in words. Some things just were. A hunter who couldn't pull the trigger, a buffalo that remembered, a debt repaid across 4 years and miles of open country. None of it should have happened. All of it did. Porter had spread the story through the settlements, though he told it carefully, knowing how strange it sounded. Most people nodded politely and changed the subject. A few asked questions. Nobody called him a liar to his face, but Ken could see the doubt in their eyes. He didn't blame them. If someone had told him the same story 6 weeks ago, he wouldn't have believed it either, but the scar on his side was real. The hoof prints in the grass had been real. The white buffalo with the scarred shoulder had been real, and whatever had passed between them in that clearing 4 years ago had been real enough to bring the entire herd back. When he needed them most, Marlowe Kane had come by last week, older now, grayer. He'd heard about what happened and wanted to see if the story was true. Callan had shown him the scar, told him everything. Marlowe had listened without interrupting, then shook his head slowly. "You threw away $300 for that animal, and it saved your life." He'd laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I don't know whether you're the luckiest man alive or the biggest fool I ever met. Maybe both." Ken had watched him right away, knowing he'd never see him again. Some doors closed and didn't reopen. That was fine. He made his peace with it. The wound had cost him most of his savings and medical care. The merchant company had paid him for the job, but barely enough to cover expenses. Winter was coming again, and his supplies were low again, and he was right back where he'd started 4 years ago, broke, uncertain, living day to day. But he wasn't the same man. That was the difference. He made a choice that defied logic and somehow survived the consequences. He learned that mercy wasn't weakness, that compassion wasn't foolishness, that sometimes the things you let go came back to you in ways you never expected. He still worked as a guide, still led wagons through dangerous country, still read the land for threats, and kept people safe. But now, when he crossed the grasslands, he watched for buffalo, and sometimes on clear mornings when the light hit right, he'd see them in the distance, a herd moving slowly across the horizon, white shapes among the brown. He never got close enough to be sure, never tried to. He didn't need to. What had happened between them was finished. For years ago, he'd looked an animal in the eye and chosen not to kill it. Last month, that same animal had appeared when he was dying, and its herd had formed a protective circle around him. The events were connected by his choice and the remarkable behavior that followed. And Ken Forge, hunter turned guide, carried the scar and the story for the rest of his days, knowing that sometimes the best shot you ever make is the one you don't take. He'd spared a rare animal when logic said to kill it. Years later, that animal had returned when he was wounded and dying. The herd had formed a protective circle until help arrived. Simple cause and effect. Remarkable, yes, but real. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale from the frontier where choices and consequences collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to